Welcome back to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag, the true story of how a kid who once had nothing, no direction, and no shot built a life worth living. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you like what you hear, I encourage you to go back and check out this story from the very first episode. This podcast is about what it really takes to climb out from rock bottom and why that's always possible. I'm your host, Michael. Let's get into it. This is episode 9, Card Towers. I never really considered owning my own business until I was suddenly doing it. It wasn't a dream I had for myself, but rather it was just a means to an end. I needed to earn a living somehow, and no one would hire me otherwise due to the economy and my criminal record. I think it was in the movie Field of Dreams where the ethereal ghost's voice said to the farmer, "If you build it, they will come." And that was sort of how my business worked for me. I just handed out some door flyers and the calls started rolling in. I would set up appointments to give a quote based on my own time estimates and with some consideration for relative prices of my competition locally. And then I just started taking jobs. Little by little, my reputation grew and I didn't need to hand out door flyers anymore. I went from just aerating lawns and doing simple mow and blows to more complicated jobs like paver patio installations and large fencing projects. My acumen grew and my confidence with it. But, running a business is hard. And so to all the folks out there reading this or listening along who had the pleasure or misfortune of ever being my customer, I'm sorry. I was still working out the kinks, and I never managed to get it right all of the time. It was also really hard to start and run a business when you're poor. I had no working capital, no business experience, and no access to credit due to a horrible credit score. I'm not making excuses for myself, but these were the challenges. I also had no access to business banking services because I previously had a bank account closed within the last 3 years. And so I was in check systems and couldn't open one, even on the business side. So it was really hard to live one day at a time, keeping my cash in my pocket and trying to manage all the jobs. I had customers who wanted me to cover the costs of installations and then pay when the work was done, but sometimes they wouldn't pay or they'd pay late and others not at all. And all the time I would be wondering when the next money would come to fill my gas tank or pay the help I hired that day. Equipment would break down and I would have no working capital to replace it. So I would buy cheap, ineffective equipment as like a stopgap with the money that I had in my pocket, but that would just make jobs take longer because it was less effective equipment and my payouts would be smaller. And those sort of things just added up in a sort of snowball effect kind of way. I rented a lot of equipment too, but it was really hard to pass on the rental costs to my customers while staying competitive with my, competition. And there's a lot of it in that industry. And so I truly believe that no one learns anything getting it right all the time. That wholeheartedly. So the whole experience was an exercise in learning and growing pretty much constantly. If I didn't know jack shit when I started, I sure as hell learned pretty quick, one mistake at a time. And maybe that's the best way to learn anyways. Around this time, I was served a letter, though, from the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office that I was being summoned for a parentage action in Pierce County. The petitioner was Madison, and apparently Madison had gotten pregnant around the time when we were together, and she had named me as the presumed father on some parentage forms for child support. She had my name spelled wrong, and my height and weight estimates were both off. She had me about 4 inches shorter than I actually was and about 30 pounds heavier. And I wasn't happy about that, but it was enough information for the local parentage team to locate me and initiate child support proceedings. Later, Madison said she didn't even want to put my name down at all and had tried to not have me know about this child at all. But apparently, the local division of child support had coerced her with the threat that they were going to start billing her for the support she had used when she was pregnant if she didn't give up my name instead so that they could go after me. Uh, you know, altruism, right? So I appeared in court in Pierce County and requested genetic testing, and they sent me down to this small clinic across the street where I was swabbed in the cheek. And a few weeks later, the genetic test results were back, and I had a new court date for determination of the amount of child support I would be paying. I was the father, like Maury Povich. I felt sort of gutted though. Caitlin was outraged at this situation. Our son was like only 6 months old, and I don't think she felt like she was allowed to be mad at me for something that happened before we met, But at the same time, I think she resented me that it had even happened at all. And I mean, our marriage was already on the rocks. We hadn't fared well after I lost my job. And it didn't get any better after my uncle died. We were poor, and that just made all of the normal challenges that much harder. Caitlin continued to grow distant week over week, and sometimes it felt like I was sleeping in a bed next to a stranger. I tried to establish contact with my newly discovered daughter, Ellie. Initially, I had some success in meeting with Madison and initiating some visitation, but I wasn't really handling the reveal well, and I got in a few spats with Madison during pickups and drop-offs. Really, I resented Madison for not including me in Ellie's birth or even her early life, and for me even having to find out about her through a child support letter and not a text message. I was angry, and I hadn't totally figured out how to resolve it. So we would just bicker about the stupidest little things and have these little spats. And eventually Madison just stopped engaging with me for a visitation with Ellie, and our contact fell off altogether. And I didn't have the money at the time for an attorney. So I tried to go to a few free consultations to weigh my options, but the minimum retainers were way out of my budget. And I didn't have much of a know-how of the legal system, and I just felt totally powerless and incapable of doing anything beyond hope that Madison would just eventually get back in touch with me. And she never did. I wrote birthday cards and letters. I hoped they were received and maybe read, but I never knew. I continued to pay my child support every month, and that was as involved as I was ever allowed to be. If you ever are listening to this, Ellie, I have loved you all along. All along. Simultaneous to my marriage with Caitlin falling apart, my business started to really struggle as well. I mean, finances were tight. My truck had been repossessed, and I was struggling to keep up with the new child support bill. To make matters worse, I hadn't properly collected taxes for my business. I really didn't fully understand how that process worked. So I had believed I had been paying my taxes through my annual federal tax returns, but I wasn't aware of the separate reporting process for collection of sales taxes with Washington's Department of Revenue. I thought I was a service business and that mowing lawns, I didn't need to collect taxes. And so when they gave me a massive bill, estimated based on my overall revenue for 2 years, my whole world was already falling apart. I had medical debt, collections piling sky high. I had an eviction on my record. I couldn't open a bank account or take out a loan. And my only source of revenue, my business, was rapidly failing due to lack of working capital to cover the daily working business expenses. So that tax situation was sort of like the nail in the coffin for my ability to pull out. At the same time, my grandfather died. And it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, saying goodbye to my grandpa Dwayne in the hospital and watching him fade away was like another sadness too much. It wasn't unexpected, as he had long struggled with health issues related to smoking cigarettes. I had to watch this strong man from my childhood, who would work on cars with me and show me how to shoot guns, sort of fade away into this frail man who was on his last dance. It was his final exit from the world, and I was just a spectator. He was dying of heart failure from COPD and chronic emphysema. While he was unconscious and connected to machinery helping him breathe, I laid beside him in his hospital bed and said my goodbyes. On my way home from the hospital, I played the Cold Mountain soundtrack because the music was like Appalachian sounding and reminded me of my grandfather. I think I cried most of the drive. My wife, she was sitting beside me in silence. And after a few songs, she asked that I turn the music off because my crying was bothering her. She said she didn't see the point in intentionally playing music that was making me sad. And that in that moment, I was just like stricken with grief. And I realized just in her demeanor and in her coldness that the love she once had for me was gone. The light had gone out. We'd been fighting for some time, and I'd even asked her to try marriage counseling with me. We went to a provider who was covered under our state health insurance for free, but our counselor was relatively ineffective and uninterested. And after a few sessions, it seemed to have done more harm to our marriage than good. I want to be clear. Caitlin isn't the antagonist of this chapter or story. I failed to meaningfully provide for our family, which caused external stress on our marriage. My business wasn't successful after all my efforts. Our son was growing older every day, and I think I looked more and more inept at being able to provide for her long term. And I think she just sort of lost all respect for me in that time period. She didn't see a bright future at the end of our lives. And at some point, I think she probably decided she was better off without me. She didn't say that with words necessarily, at least not too often, but with actions, with constant distance, palpable resentment. I tried to change our course, but at the end of the day, the outcome was the same. She didn't want to be married to me anymore. I moved in with some friends in Bonnie Lake. I had to give her some space. And around that time, I decided to set up a Facebook because it was getting more popular. And my wife had one from some of her time in her college days. And she seemed to use it often enough. And so I set up an account and joined the modern age. It was sort of reeling, though, when I saw her profile for the first time, as she wasn't listed as being married and had a long list of comments, interactions, and correspondence with one guy in particular who we'd known through a mutual friend. I knew something felt off right away by what I was seeing. He was a single guy and his digital attention was solely fixed on my wife. And so I asked her directly about him. And she was initially caught off guard, but admitted that they'd had some ongoing contact. She said that they'd been exchanging messages for some time and that she'd set up some time to see him in person. I begged her not to go, but she refused. And so in a last act of desperation, I took off my wedding ring and got on my hands and knees and said, please either stop seeing him or just take this ring from me now and spare me the heartbreak. I thought that maybe I was being a bit dramatic, but ultimately that she would see my desperation. And really, I was just trying to make a point that her relationship with this guy was hurting me during a time when I felt deprived of her affection. I wanted her to know that I was scared of losing her, and so that's what I did. But she took the ring off right out of my hand and walked out the door. And that was the last time I saw her before she sent me the papers for our divorce. I was crushed. Breaking up was hard, but more so it was the death of a dream. I didn't really believe in God at the time, and I was still mostly an atheist, and so I didn't know how to pray for help. I was reading this stupid audiobook called The Secret by Rhonda Burns. I mean, it's not stupid necessarily if it helps you. And I don't think as a concept manifesting your dreams is inherently bad. But I needed a God to pray to. And instead I believed that through sheer power of will, I could manifest my marriage back into existence. With just sheer power of will and positive mental thought exercises, I thought I could somehow manifest a lotto win or some other financial windfall. And that was all I needed to save my marriage. If I just had enough money, I could save my marriage. If I just had enough money, I could fix my whole life. And so I would think positive thoughts to manifest all of the things I wanted and needed, and nothing would happen. Everything continued to fall apart all around me. Thanks for listening to Odyssey of a Teenage Dirtbag. Every episode is another piece of the story. Proof that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back up. If this episode meant something to you, share it. Like and subscribe below if you haven't already. Until next time, keep chasing the life you were meant to live.